Thanks very much, and thanks for the opportunity to talk tonight. I've got rather a lot that I want to share with you, but I'll take the cue from you about what appetite you have for that. Can I begin, first of all, by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land and paying respects to elders past and present. I have to say that the approach about coming and joining Oxfam was somewhat of a surprise to me, and I've had the most amazing 18 months in the role. So coming into a sector and coming into an organisation which, as Michael says, not only does the work on the ground and does the scale-up response in the case of emergency responses, but also tries to really look at the systemic and underlying causes of what generates poverty and inequality. So it's been a terrific time, and I feel very privileged to be in the role. So what I want to do is, I do want to share with you the work that we've done in dealing with the big four Australian banks, and in particular what we've looked at is their support for companies engaged in land grabs. And we've done this because inevitably when a land grab occurs, what that does is it displaces people, often without appropriate supports and conditions, and exacerbates their own experience of poverty. But before we do that, I just want to give you a little bit of a context from our perspective. So over the past 30 years, what we know is that banking and finance have become entwined in the daily lives of everyday Australians. Most of us hold debt through credit cards, mortgages, student loans, and more of our savings are held in shares and superannuation funds. We know that these changes in banking is really part of a global trend, and as a result, banking and finance impact on our work at Oxfam in ways that we simply couldn't have imagined a few years ago. And a key area where change has occurred is actually in the food and agricultural sector. You know that food is a fundamental human need. Children who face hunger, even for a short period of time, can face lifelong effects to their mental and physical development, impacting their future quality of life. You also know that hunger can force families into heartbreaking decisions. Children are pulled out of school or people leave their homes. Women and girls are particularly vulnerable, and for more than 50 years, Oxfam has responded to food crises and worked long-term to try to strengthen community food security. This has been at the heart of much of our work. Worldwide, from the 1980s until the early 2000s, we saw long periods of low levels of overseas aid money and state and private sector investment going into agriculture, and this has changed rapidly in the 21st century. Banks and finance companies have dramatically increased their holdings in agriculture. The biofuels boom is driving demand for crops like palm oil, corn and sugar to be used as fuel. The plummeting faith in financial markets has seen investors take their money from more speculative investments to put into agriculture and land. An economist, and I'm not one, but an economist may tell you that this shift commonly occurs during periods of low economic growth. However, some academics and other observers perceive that this current land boom is actually part of a deeper long-term change towards increased global competition for control of natural resources. The 2007 and 2008 food price shocks were also a key catalyst in deepening this financial demand for agricultural land. Despite the world producing more than enough food to feed everyone, food prices suddenly spiked, creating a crisis situation for tens of thousands of people who rely on food that they do not grow themselves. The causes of the food price shocks remain contested, but there is a significant argument that finance sector money flowing into and out of food markets at a rapid rate contributed to a higher and much less predictable pricing in the food area. The food price shocks have driven a global discussion about the sustainability of our food and land systems. This includes valid concerns about climate change and the declining fertility of our soil and water. Separate to these important discussions about how we can better share and care for our natural resources is a dangerous, speculative frenzy where food and land are treated like a new gold rush. While it's hard for us to know the exact figures because of the secrecy surrounding many of the deals, especially those where large swathes of land are forcibly acquired, groups such as the Land Matrix estimate that since 2001, nearly 36 million hectares of land has been snapped up in large-scale land deals. So that's effectively an area the size of Germany. Most of these large-scale land deals have taken place in the past 5 years, and most of them have occurred on Australia's doorstep, with Southeast Asia leading the world as the largest region. Much of this land has gone to agriculture for biofuels, commodity crops like sugar, and food crops for export. In many cases, these land deals are undertaken illegally or unfairly in what we call land grabs. People are forced off their land or tricked into giving it up without adequate consent. And this creates the cruel paradox where new agricultural or forestry projects can actually increase hunger as vulnerable people are forced from the farms, forest and coastal fisheries that they rely on for their livelihoods and survival. Oxfam globally has followed the issue of land grabs closely because in many poor and vulnerable communities, social equity, gender equality and access to food are all intimately tied to direct land and water access. Our work to improve social wellbeing and human rights is increasingly aligned with efforts to safeguard and strengthen local and global ecologies by sustaining precious biodiversity and protecting the integrity of soils and water sources. To put it simply, for many of these communities, land is life. The global context of change to the role that finance plays in our daily lives and the advent of a new global land rush are important in shaping Oxfam's Bank and Land Grabs campaign. It was our link, for example, to the Turrbal community in the East Sepik province of Papua New Guinea that first allowed us to see this connection between Australian banks and land grabs. Land in Turrbal was grabbed by a company that promised an oil palm development, failed to get informed consent from the community, and is now logging thousands of hectares of rainforests. For years, our partner, Turrbal Ecoforestry, has supported customary landowners to seek justice. Turrbal Ecoforestry introduced us to Martha Wakmar, who told us how loggers destroyed her house to build a road. In her words, and I quote, "They put us into the new house, but we don't feel comfortable here. It's very hot inside during the day because of the metal roofing, and when it's raining, all the water comes inside and destroys our things." Martha no longer has access to land for a food garden. It's not clear where the money for this wanton destruction in Turrbal has gone. Tracing a complex web of companies, we found a likely link with a large global logging company, WTK Realty Limited. Westpac has a 19-year relationship with WTK. We then wondered whether there were other examples involving other Australian banks. We did some digging and we uncovered connections between all the big four banks and land grabs. We detailed these in our report that we released in April, Banking on Shaky Ground, Australia's Big Four Banks and Land Grabs. We found that the Commonwealth Australia Bank has over $14 million in shares in Bunge, a global agribusiness company. In Mato Grosso do Sul in Brazil, Bunge has bought a sugar mill that is sourcing sugar from farmers on land of the Guarani-Kaiowai people in Jatavari. In the 1990s, this group were pushed off their land for 4 years, facing intimidation from sugar farmers on their return. In 2004, they had the land recognised as Indigenous land by the relevant federal agency, but in 2008, the sugar mill was established. Sourcing sugar from the farms on the lands of these people exacerbates and increases local conflict and delays processes for formalising the land rights of the people guaranteed under law. One woman, Aditsa Durati, described the sugar plantations as putting an end to her culture by clearing the forest and spreading poison. the dangerous chemicals sprayed on the plantation. In her words, she said the company began spreading the fertilisers on the land. After, they plant the sugar cane and spread the poison again, even on top of us, even close to our house. And when it rained, the water flowed down towards the river where we bathe and get drinking water. Children got ill with diarrhoea and skin infections and other illnesses. We also discovered that the National Australia Bank has lent more than $218 million to a large Asian palm oil company, Wilmar. Its first loan was in 2010, just after the World Bank had suspended lending to Wilmar and the entire palm oil industry in response to numerous complaints. Its second loan in 2013 followed Newsweek ranking Wilmar as the least sustainable company in the world in terms of environmental performance for 2 years running. There have also been credible complaints that Wilmar has been complicit in land grabs in Nigeria. Following a global campaign to urge Wilmar investors to be more responsible, Wilmar has adopted a no deforestation, no peat, no exploitation policy. Yet while Wilmar has made this change, the National Australia Bank has still not publicly committed to zero tolerance for land grabs. In Cambodia, the ANZ Bank financed a Cambodian company, Phnom Penh Sugar, notorious for sugar plantation in Kampong Spur. According to reports in the Age newspaper, Phnom Penh Sugar is headed by a powerful senator who has been implicated in land grabs, food shortages and child labour. And before lending money to Phnom Penh Sugar, the ANZ's own audit raised serious concerns about this project. The systemic power of the company and the risk of violence to the community led the community affected by the plantation to see engaging with ANZ as a way of actually pressuring Phnom Penh Sugar to be more accountable. They were very clear with us, and we mentioned it in our report, that they didn't want the bank to make a swift exit, but they wanted the bank to help increase the company's accountability. Of all of these cases that we focused on, this has been had the most media attention. So this is Phnom Penh Sugar and the ANZ Bank. In July 2014, Phnom Penh Sugar suddenly repaid its loan to the ANZ just weeks after meeting with community groups to discuss the terms for conducting an independent third-party human rights assessment. ANZ claims that this was a direct result of it raising concerns about the company's practices and says it has no ongoing responsibility to the community. Yet the community and the groups working closely with it pointed out that the ANZ financed activities from 2010 to 2014 that contributed to the terrible condition of many people in the Kampong Spur and what they still face today, while many still lack access to sufficient water. Groups working closely with the community are calling for the ANZ to help support people to rebuild their lives and to gain access to basic services. Now, we also found other links between banks and credible reports of land grabs, and more have emerged since the report. For example, we recently found out that Westpac owns millions of dollars in shares in Bunge, the company contributing to land conflict in the Jatavari outlined above. So before we started the campaign, Oxfam had no special expertise in the finance sector. What we found is no doubt just the tip of the iceberg. We focused our work on the Big Four Australian banks because so many Australians bank with the Big Four. Australians are connected to these banks through our savings accounts, through our credit cards, our mortgages and our superannuation savings. The websites of some larger, more transparent superannuation funds like UniSuper, Hester, Cbus and Legal Super clearly show that they manage shares in all of the Big Four banks. These four funds alone manage tens of billions of dollars. We've actually been overwhelmed by the public response to our banks and land grabs campaign when we kicked it off with high-profile media in April. We had an exclusive with the ABC 7:30 program and the Fairfax media covered it. And it was quickly followed by the majority of other mainstream outlets jumping on board. Since then, more than 6,000 Australians have written letters to their banks, raising concerns about land grabs, and I'm often approached by people shocked to learn that their money could be going to companies that are forcing people off their land in places like Turrbal and in places like Kampong Spur. In Australia, I think we've seen people who've been outraged to think that when they take out a mortgage for their own home, their money could be used to kick other families out of their home. One reason that people are shocked is because the banks often present themselves as ethical investors. Each of the big four banks has a set of internal policies related to environmentally and socially responsible investment. They have also signed into various sustainability commitments under the UN, the OECD, and other initiatives like the Equitable Principles. Yet none of these policies or commitments comprehensively addresses land grabs. In many cases, commitments to global agreements are self-reporting, so there is no independent oversight, or there's insufficient details given, such as the names of leading clients, making any objective cross-checking impossible. In the worst cases, this allows banks to claim that they are responsible without being held to account. So how far have we got with our campaign? So to date, the banks have promised to review their policies, but no bank has committed to zero tolerance for land grabbing. Such an approach from our perspective would ensure that the banks have clear policies to protect and promote the lands of communities affected by the company and supplier operations of its clients. It would also ensure, for example, that banks require companies that they deal with to apply the principles of free, prior and informed consent in relation to land use. In short, it means the communities are fully informed about proposals to use their land. After hundreds and thousands of people around the world signed petitions and took action as part of Oxfam's global campaign to urge food and beverage companies to respect community land rights, we actually saw two of the giants in the agriculture sector, PepsiCo and CocaCola, commit to zero tolerance for land grabs. So we know that this is actually possible. Oxfam has called on the banks to disclose their relationship with companies in the agriculture sector whose businesses require large-scale land access. It's important in helping communities see the link between companies and the groups that finance them. So far, the banks have resisted our call for disclosure, yet banks already have processes for disclosing client information for marketing purposes. And this is shared extensively within the financial sector databases that are too expensive for most groups like the NGOs to access. So a colleague reminded me recently that once upon a time, Nike and Coca-Cola said they couldn't share information about companies that make their shoes or supply their sugar. Yet today they do, as does Kmart, following campaigning by Oxfam and others in response to the tragic Rana Plaza building collapse in Bangladesh last year. In July, the Responsible Investment Association of Australasia released a report showing that responsible and ethical investments perform better in the longer term when compared to non-ethical investments. And this debunks the myth that ethical business is bad for business. Responsible investment, from our perspective, can drive innovation by looking to support industries that won't accept the risk of supporting companies that back human rights abuses. We're in the very early stages of our campaign, but we're aware that achieving real change in the banking sector so that there is no longer supporting companies that engage in land grabs will require a long-term commitment. The ability to work towards a larger, longer-term goal is, I believe, what's remarkable about the work of Oxfam and our predecessor, Community Aid Abroad. For years, Oxfam has been synonymous with fair trade through providing opportunities for Australians to buy ethical coffee, chocolate and other goods through our shops, and through our campaigns for fairer conditions for vulnerable workers. Together with others, we have fostered this movement, and today choosing to buy fair trade is a simple choice. So I began today by talking about the large changes we've seen in the ways that the banking and finance shape our activities in our everyday life and how that's changed over the last 30 years. More and more people are aware of activities in the financial sector and the harm that can be done to communities. Already in the EU and the US, we've seen a strong shareholder movement that has emerged as a response. Oxfam believes that in Australia we're seeing a similar change as customers and shareholders are increasingly calling for banks and others in the financial sector to invest our money sustainably, responsibly, and without supporting companies that violate human rights. So, the question is, how ethical are our banks? And I would answer, as ethical as we can make them. Finance is a world built on trust and reputation. If that reputation is damaged or undermined, it could have incredible monetary consequences. We've seen this in dropping share prices that followed the Commonwealth Bank of Australia's financial services scandal. While it sometimes feels like banks are huge and monolithic, in our campaign we've discovered that customers raising their concerns together can get the bank's attention, as a bank's reputation has real monetary value. Already 13,000 people have signed our petitions against land grabs, and 6,000 people have written letters to their banks. This action is gaining the attention of senior staffers at the banks, people that it's rare for an NGO or even many companies to gain access to. And while ultimately we will measure our success on seeing concrete steps towards zero tolerance for land grabs and justice for affected communities, this at least shows that the banks are listening. The next step is to sustain this momentum and to build it further so the banks know the public concern about land grabs is not going to go away. So I guess my challenge to you and to me is that if you bank with one of the big four banks, if you have a mortgage with them, if you are a shareholder, then we'd invite you to add your voice to the Banks and Land Grabs campaign. Help support it. Communities in places like Turrboo in their struggle for their land and for fair access to food by making sure that Australian banks are committed to growing their business by working with communities and not against them. Thank you very much.